In today's video, we're going to be comparing the Lie-Nielsen versus the Luban hand plane to see where they differ. Hope you enjoy. Just so you're aware, I'll be comparing the Lie-Nielsen number 5 versus the Luban number 4. I don't have a Luban number 5, otherwise I'd compare the 5 versus the 5, but they're so similar that it doesn't really matter. These are going to be a pretty good showing of a comparison. So let's jump in and get started. We can see they've both got the same brushed finish. They've got the same practically identical design on the sole where the paint sits. They both have bronze lever caps, bronze screws here. This one has, the Lie-Nielsen has a bronze frog, whereas the Luban just has a straight painted frog, so it's a steel frog. Bronze depth adjusters. We'll have a closer look at all of this in a little bit. Just having a quick look at the handles here, we can see these are Babinga, these ones are cherry. We can see a slight difference in the machining of the body down here, the way the paint sits. So before we go ahead and take a closer look at all the different parts, we're going to have some scoring system up here like I've done in the past, probably up over this side, and we're going to try and see who comes out on top. I'm going to have to be quite picky with this one because I don't think there's too much differences between it, but we'll wait and see when we get there. So before we go ahead and do that, we're going to go down to the piece of pine here. Yes, I'm using pine because I think pine, if your blade is not sharp, if there's any gaps, pine's going to cause you more issues, so that's why I always like to use pine for testing this. I know some people are, oh, you should use hardwood, but most of these planes, both of these, can plane hardwood just as well. But any plane that's going to have issues with the gaps between the back of the blade and the chip break and all that, pine is the one that's going to cause a lot of problems because the grain seam flexes and it can push in parts where hardwoods won't. So I know some of you don't agree with that, but that's what I'm going to be doing here. So one thing I have done is I sharpened both of these blades. I've rolled the corners on both of them so they're completely identical. So we're actually good to go with nice sharp blades. So I've already set this to take a fine shaving. It's taking a little bit there, I just need to square it up slightly, and we'll just advance this blade a little bit. You can see we're taking a full width shaving here already. So it's a fairly fine shaving. It's a fraction, it could be slightly thinner, but I wanted to get a full width nice shaving. So there's a little bit of resistance as you would expect with this taking a shaving. The shaving comes out nice. You can see we get a nice sort of full width shaving here. They're perfect, nice, very thin. The plane feels nice and balanced, but we also have that resistance on the sole here because it's not lubricated, and you're always going to lubricate one of these. Now we're going to go to the Luban and then we'll lubricate the sole afterwards. So, well, we're clearly taking a very thick shaving here, so let's just bring that shaving width back a bit. So we're getting little wispy ones, so I'm just going to advance it slightly. Trying to get a similar thickness in shaving. So there we go, we've got a similar thickness in shaving. Let's go back to the Lie-Nielsen. We'll give the sole a quick lubricant on here. So this is just Camilla oil. Now let's... Oh, that just glides so effortlessly and just shaves off. Perfect shavings every time. Do the same to the Luban. Likewise, This works a lot better when the sole's lubricated, and I never recommend using a hand plane without a sole lubricated because it just works so much easier. And it means that you're not damaging the sole and gouging out the metal, because if you do enough hand planing, you can still put the sole of a metal plane out a square just like a wooden one, but it takes a lot longer. So that's why you always want to lubricate them. If I had to nitpick between these two, I think the Lie-Nielsen feels a little bit better going through them. It feels like it's taking a shaving a little bit more consistently and a little bit easier. Now that could come down to sharpening with these, but I think what that really comes down to is there's a little more weight in the number 5, just because it's a little bit heavier and a little bit longer. It just does it a little bit easier. But to be honest, we have a draw here in how these feel, especially once you lubricate the sole. If we don't lubricate the sole, Lie-Nielsen wins, but you're always going to be using them lubricated, so we've got a nice draw here. So let's have a look at the Lie-Nielsen first. We're engaged. Starts catching there, starts catching there. Now, one test that a lot of people don't do is we look in here without it under tension. We can see this blade moves straight away, and it requires a little bit more of a turn under the tension of the lever cap to actually get moving. But we can see what's really considered backlash is not really backlash. We can see actively here that the blade is moving up, and we want to move it down, and it moves down straight away. So while on the wheel it looks like quarter of a turn, really there's no backlash in this one at all. But if you wanted to do it with it in there, I think you could say maybe quarter of a turn, which is practically nothing. So we're going to have a look at the Luban now. So we can see the thread is engaged there. And until it catches and actually moves the blade, it's about an entire turn. But we can see that that is actively moving like the Lie-Nielsen straight away. So if we do the check on top here, it's moving up, moving down, moving up, moving down. It moves straight away. So that leaves me no choice to give these each 1 point, because I don't think there's really any difference in the backlash. It might feel a little bit, and that could be to do with the actual thread pattern on the thread, and we'll have a look at that when we actually get these frogs out later on. But you can see turning the wheel is not necessarily the indicator of backlash, because you can see as soon as we look at the top, you turn that wheel one way and turn it the other way and it moves straight away. What backlash is, in my opinion, is where you actually need to turn it a lot before it actually starts engaging and moving the blade. So here, the blade moves straight away when you turn it the opposite way, so there's actually no backlash there. So let's actually take these out and have a closer look. We can see they're both bronze, and we can see that Lie-Nielsen is about, I'd say 3 millimeters longer than the one on the Luban. It's the same width, because it kind of has to be. And if we look at the side profile just here, you can see that the Lie-Nielsen is a little more turned on the top here. There's not much in it. The Lie-Nielsen one is a little more polished versus the more dull sheen look of the Luban one. Now that is partially because it's already sort of weathered a little bit, and I've had this one for a year versus this one not. But the Luban one, when I first got it, didn't have a very, very high polish, and that's really the only difference here between these. They all look identical. They've both got a copper little strike spring. The Lie-Nielsen has a number 6 in there, something to do with the numbering of their batches. The Luban doesn't. But other than that, and there's a little Luban decal on here. Now before we round it out, the very last thing I noticed on this is the Lie-Nielsen is rough here, whereas the Luban one has actually been machined to make it flat. So I don't think it really matters. This one's more pointed on the Lie-Nielsen, so it actually runs right onto the point, whereas the Luban one is a little flat. So that's really the only difference there. Otherwise, they're pretty much identical. So we're going to give 1 point to each here. If we compare them, you can see that the Luban one is a little bit wider. It's a little bit fatter. That doesn't necessarily mean much. The piece at the top here that it has no thread on it is slightly longer, and that will be to do with the way and how high the Lie-Nielsen lever cap comes in. But other than that, the slot is slightly larger on the Luban. Might be to do with what they had available for machining it, but there is a slightly wider slot there, which is a little annoying. But to be honest, both these slots are actually oversized to a lot of normal screwdrivers, at least flatheads that I've got. So yeah, so if I had to nitpick this one, I would say that this one goes to Lie-Nielsen, just because the size of that slot is a little more normal sized. This is our Lie-Nielsen chip breaker, this is our Luban chip breaker. Now, we can see that I've had to sharpen the chip breaker on this, and I haven't quite taken it to a full polish, but it still operates fine. You don't really need to take it to a full polish. You can see the sort of matte polish that the Lie-Nielsen one has had. This was machined straight out of the factory, it was flat on the back. I did have to do some work to get the Luban one just to make a little bit. I had to do just a little bit just to flatten it out across here, but I also had to do that with the blade, which we'll get to in a minute. We can see when it comes to the actual design of these, we have the round circle on the Lie-Nielsen, and we have the slot with the rounded edges, whereas in the Luban we have this more traditional sort of shape here, which I have seen on a lot of my vintage ones rather than a circle. I think the circle's probably a little bit easier to do, so that's why it's there, but if it works, it works. This gives a little more play in the movement of the blade up and down. Not that you ever really need to protrude it anywhere near this amount, and there's enough on this one to protrude it. So there's only a small chamfer on the Luban screw versus the larger one on the Lie-Nielsen. Once again, the slot is slightly oversized on the Luban one, but overall the actual matte finish of the Lie-Nielsen shows some streaky marks versus it being a little more polished on the Luban. And we can also see that the Lie-Nielsen one is slightly longer than the Luban. Other than that, there's not too much difference. Moving on to the blade, we can see the Luban blade is longer in length, and it does have the same amount of cutting or depth of cut to the circle just here. And due to that, there is a shorter slot on the Lie-Nielsen versus the longer one on the Luban, which is more of that traditional really long design. We've both got a decal here. My Luban's picked up a little bit of rust out here in the uninsulated workshop, although I do oil it up, and so that'll need to be cleaned up. But the only difference here is that the Lie-Nielsen has done less machining in my opinion here, and they've stamped it square here, whereas the Luban is actually round at the top. And I actually do prefer the rounder top of the blade so you don't nick your fingers on the top of it at times, but the square cut is actually more traditional. If you look at the old vintage planes, they were more square here. The Lie-Nielsen has had a very, very light chamfer put around all these edges, so they're smooth to touch, whereas the Luban is a little bit square and just a little bit sharp. So that's just something you got to bear in mind, and that is really the only difference in these, other than the fact that the original finish on the Luban, you can see the machining marks here. They are quite deep machining marks, and you'll see that in the footage that I've already shown you there, versus it being nice and smooth here. We also had quite the machining and deep grooves on the bevel of the Luban versus the Lie-Nielsen, which was good to go. So the Luban was not ready straight out of the box to go. The Lie-Nielsen was ready to go. If you're comparing the overall, there's not too much there. The Luban just needed a little more preparation, flattening the back of the blade, grinding the deeper bevel grinder marks out of the bevel when you first started with it. But other than that, there's not too much difference between them. But Lie-Nielsen, once again, since I'm being nitpicky, wins this one. Now, the very first thing you can all see is that the Luban has the more traditional just bent piece of metal twisted on the top here and riveted in here with a more rounded top rivet, and then a wide piece that actually fits. And if we drop it in here, it fits. Let me just drop that in here. You can see that it actually fits very tight on, and there's actually no slop there at all. It twists the blade instantly because this piece is nice and wide to fit the Luban. If we have a look at the Lie-Nielsen one, we have just a little free spinning piece that a lot of people call a bearing. We can see that this is a thicker piece of metal. There's a little bit of bronze up the top here with a couple of machine screws. So let's have a look at how that works. And we can see once again, there is no slop there at all, and it moves nicely. We've got a bedrock, so we obviously have 2 pins on each side here. So we also have 3 screws on the back, as we know with the bedrock system, and we'll take them apart and have a closer look at them. So what I'm going to do is just see how easy it is to undo both of these, starting with the Lie-Nielsen here. Now, these should both come out pretty easily. And you just got to keep turning these screws until it comes free. The Luban. And to be honest, the travel that we have here on both of these is about the same to get both of those out. So let's just get the bodies out of the way for a sec and we'll look at the frogs. We can see, if you have a look here, we can see they've both got pins here. The pins are almost identical, and we can see on the top, Luban has just a little punched bit here. Lie-Nielsen has machined a little slot there. I don't think there's much difference there, punched or not. Now, if we look at the actual pins themselves, the Luban has a slightly larger pin. It has a larger head to it. The Lie-Nielsen has a little light chamfer under here. And we actually have a larger conical piece on the front of the Luban. So everything's a little bit larger with the pins on the Luban. Now, they both seem to operate fine. In my mind, I think larger is slightly better, but they both lock down fine, so I don't think there's too many issues there. But we're looking at the frog as a whole, so let's go on and have a look at the rest of it. We obviously already know the difference. That this one's is bronze, this one is just the ductile steel, like the sole. Is there too many differences here? No. The Lie-Nielsen one looks like it is about the same length. The machining looks almost identical. Obviously we've got a slightly smaller machined hole here versus the larger one in the ductile steel. This might be slightly smaller because I think it was probably necessary in the bronze not to get too close to the edges, because that could be a little bit weaker knowing that it's a little bit softer than the ductile steel. We can see that we don't have any paint on the bronze because it just doesn't need it versus the paint that we have on the Luban. There is a couple of little blemishes on the side of the casting just here, which I reckon that if Lie-Nielsen had that, they probably would have rejected it or sold it as a seconds or something like that. But you can see a little tiny blemish just here and here where the paint rolls over into it. It doesn't affect the operation. Everything's still flat. Both these are smooth, machined to, I don't know, at least a 400 grit would be my guess. We can see there is a slight difference in how high both these yokes come up. Now, this one rocks side to side on the Luban, and on the Lie-Nielsen it rocks side to side, which I was surprised that this rocks side to side so much on the Lie-Nielsen. There's a much wider gap for that to rock side to side, whereas there's not much gap here for the Luban. Luban comes up a little bit higher and actually grabs the front. So when the blade is in here, it actually grabs to about here on that slot, versus when the Lie-Nielsen one is in here, it actually only grabs the back of the slot. So there's a little difference there. They both still operate fine, as I've already mentioned. Now, looking at the side profile looks identical to one another. So now that we've done that, let's just take these depth adjustment knobs off and we'll compare these. The thread on the Lie-Nielsen is a little bit stiffer. It doesn't just free run as easily. Now, we can see here that the thread on the Luban is a little bit longer. Now, that probably has something to do with the fact that the Luban has that longer blade, so for adjustment up and down to go through the full range of motion if you really wanted to, which you wouldn't, but to get that longer blade all the way up, based on where the chip breaker holds it, it probably needs a slightly longer thread versus the Lie-Nielsen. The thread rate on both of these looks like it's identical. There doesn't look like there is any difference to me in the thread rate. We can see on the back here that the Lie-Nielsen has a slightly smaller adjustment for pushing the frog back and forwards versus the Luban, which looks almost identical to some of the ones that I've seen on the replacement and later Baileys. So that might have been where that came from. It still works fine. Slightly larger versus slightly smaller. Luban has a little attention to detail with a, I think it's brass, but it could be bronze, little flathead versus the little Phillips on the Luban. Neither of them make too much difference. We can see the back of the punch here is not quite as flattened out on the Luban, but it still holds it and moves it fine. It's nice and tight. It's just had a little bit of smoothing done on the Lie-Nielsen. We can see here the much bigger gap on that yoke. So there's way less room for it to move on the Luban versus this huge gap and huge range of motion in comparison on the Lie-Nielsen. So I don't think very good machining's being done. Although it works, there's just a little bit more sideways movement, and I'll show you later on, which means that when the yoke moves on the Lie-Nielsen, then only one side of the yoke actually catches the depth adjustment wheel, versus the Luban where both of them seem to stay in contact. So I think when it comes to the yoke, that Luban actually does better there. It's also that there's a larger machining on the Luban one versus the Lie-Nielsen, which is a little bit smaller and daintier. So now that brings us to the last bit, and that's that depth adjustment knob. And both of them feel about the same weight, but you can clearly see that the Luban one, which is over here, is larger than the Lie-Nielsen one, and it's got slightly larger knurling, and the wheel is slightly wider. Now, in operation, both of these work, but I actually find that the Luban is a little more comfortable on the finger to actually move, and there's a little more, you can just grab it a little bit easier than the Lie-Nielsen. So I think, once again, Luban wins here with the depth adjustment. So yeah, although it still works, I think Luban slightly edges out there. Now, one thing I do notice is that this depth adjustment knob, until it gets to about here, is actually very stiff in the upper part, and that's probably to stop it going too far, versus the Luban, which is actually, it just moves really well can see how it free spins. Versus this one, it's very, very stiff. Now that could be because it's got slightly tighter tolerances, but I did kind of expect it to free spin like the Luban, so I think once again on the actual depth adjustment, because it moves a little bit freer through the whole thing, that the Luban actually wins there. You can actually see there, hopefully just in here, there's practically no contact at all. Compare that to the Luban, because it doesn't move. It's sitting in between that, because it barely moves on the Luban. It sits in between there. There's no losing of contact with it there. It stays in it completely. I'm a little bit conflicted in making the decision here. Although there is more detail and more machining skill required to make the lateral adjuster on the Lie-Nielsen, the one on the Luban would have been a lot cheaper to make and a lot easier to make, but it still functions identical. They're both smooth movement. And in actual fact, Lie-Nielsen is the only one I've got that actually has that little spinning captive bearing, or whatever you want to call it. I don't think it's really a bearing. It's just two pieces of metal captive there so it spins. And so I don't think that Lie-Nielsen wins in that regard there. The little blemish to the casting of the Luban does sort of count that out slightly, but then again, the larger depth adjustment knurl is a little bit easier, at least for me with my larger hands, to actually operate. It works a little better. The slightly larger size and the more accurate and less movement in the yoke of the Luban leads me to actually put Luban in the lead here, and I think I'm actually going to give this one to Luban, because that yoke, there's no excuse for it to be as loose as it is on the Lie-Nielsen, and that is not up there with the quality that I've expected with the rest of the Lie-Nielsen plane. So I'm going to give the Frog to Luban because I think it is better. Both of these are flush. They're both flat. The milling here on the Lie-Nielsen is a little bit rougher. It's much smoother here on the Luban. We can see they're both being machined down on the shoulders, so the Frog fits nice and tight and has practically no sideways wiggle. We can see that Lie-Nielsen has got equal sort of brushed metal screws here with the same sort of oversized slot, which is identical to the ones here on the Luban. There we go. Other than that, machined holes, straight, it works well and it holds it. We already know these just have a basic threaded mechanism in them, so let's just take both these front ones off. If we look here, we have a little barrel nut on the Luban with the traditional thread, just like the original, whereas Lie-Nielsen has just got a big machined screw on the front here and no barrel nut, which is not what I expected. Other than that, they both sit in place and don't rock too much. They hold firm, so that's really the only difference there. We'll just quickly take the back ones off as well. I was expecting this to actually be the same as the back one on this, but it's clearly not, as you can see. So let's just quickly put these back, put that back in, and we'll remove these back ones. We can see they both have the same design on the back handles here. So we'll crack the inner screw, which actually sits down a little bit more out of the way on the Luban, which I like that it sits down inside the handle, whereas the Lie-Nielsen one sits a little bit proud on the top here. Big difference is that the slot goes down a little bit deeper on the Luban, so it's easier to actually get it undone. You can see me just undoing it there because it's slightly oversized and not very deep. It actually burred the edge slightly. Once again, this screw is hidden right down from the top of the timber. It's not exposed at all for getting hit or catching your finger. if we look at the Lie-Nielsen one here, it's proud on the top, so if you bring your finger through there, you could knock your finger on it and catch your finger slightly. Both of these screws operate pretty much the same. They're both countersunk. The Lie-Nielsen has a slightly higher, sort of a slightly less thread count versus the Luban, which is a finer thread. And we can see when we take these off that there's practically no difference here. They look pretty much, if we turn them this way, they look pretty much the same. Except the one on the Lie-Nielsen here is slightly larger plane, slightly larger handle. That's really the only difference. So all in all, you can see that the Lie-Nielsen one does sit slightly higher, and that's ever so slightly more comfortable. There's not much in it. It's just a slightly wider handle, which you do get with a number 5 versus a number 4, which tends to be a slightly smaller handle. This slot is not deep enough to put a screw in without burring the top nut. I have to give at least the rear tote and just the handles in total, like the front knobs are pretty much identical. There's nothing wrong there, but when we look at the rear tote, which is the main handle on a hand plane, I have to give this one to Luban once again. I know that both of these are likely to have been sand cast. Now, that means that no attention on the Lie-Nielsen was paid to the actual body here, with it being rough like that. Maybe that was a personal preference to have it really rough like that, but I'm used to this smooth surface on all the vintage ones I've got, and we can see that Luban has a smooth surface here. So what that means is they either machined it after it was cast to remove the rough spots off it and get it smooth. This might have been japanned, which means it's a thicker paint job that actually covers up some of that, which I'm not so sure whether this was japanning or not. To me, it looks like it was just painting, so I think that means that a little more attention was paid to the actual sole, or maybe a finer sand was used for casting it, and that's the difference. So although it doesn't make any real difference to it, and the paint is pretty good on both of them, they've got good coverage where paint should be and all of that. I personally just prefer that smoother surface, although it doesn't affect the hand plane. Other than that, the fit and finish of both these hand planes is pretty excellent, really. On the actual body and all of that, they're pretty much identical, even down to the size of the mouths is identical, and it's just good machining on the whole across both the hand planes, and they've got that polished finish. On the sides here is the best spot to see that, because if you flatten it or use your hand plane, it's going to scratch the bottom, so we can actually see this brushed metal finish on both these ductile steel planes. So there's my comparison video here. I know the scores up in the corner say one thing, but there's not much difference between these two hand planes other than the huge price tag, in my opinion. Obviously, there's some things that I think Luban's done better, there's some things that I think Lie-Nielsen's done better, and overall, it's very hard to split these two hand planes apart from one another. There's one thing that I can't measure, and that's just the feel of the hand plane in operation. The Lie-Nielsen just feels a little bit better, but that's just a feeling, so I can't really describe what that feeling is. What it actually is probably just that Lie-Nielsen feeling. It just works ever so slightly better, but it is so minuscule, and you saw when we did those tests at the start that we got the same shavings off both these hand planes, and it's just really hard to actually pick a winner. And all in all, I don't really think there's a winner. If some of these nitpicky things I've talked about makes a big difference to you, well, then maybe one wins over the other one in one area, where another wins over another in another area. But all in all, I think we can't really, honestly, split these two hand planes apart. Even after going through some of these nitpicky things, I still can't really split these two hand planes. And so let me know what you think down below. And if you'd like to see another great comparison video such as the one you've seen here today, do check out the one down here where I compare the Melbourne Tool Company number 62 low angle jack with the Luban number 62 low angle jack. Bye for now.